In the latest GDC State of the Game Industry report, over 2,300 developers were asked how they feel about generative AI in game development, which for scale is about the number of people you would need to fully pack a medium-sized cinema. And the results are complicated. Let's start with taking a look at the current state of generative AI in game dev industry and discuss how AI tools are actually getting used in game development later in this video. On paper, everything looks very neat. AI tools are becoming more common. More developers are experimenting with them. Investors are throwing money at AI startups. Studios are writing official policies about what AI can and cannot be used for in a studio. And from the outside, it kinda looks like AI is just quietly becoming another tool in the box. But if you actually read what developers are saying, the mood is very different. As AI use goes up, so do the fears around it. The same concerns come up over and over again. Jobs being replaced.
We were trying to be responsible and make money, you know? But then the people from the future came along and now we're out of work too! Oh, they took our jobs! They took your jobs!
They took your job!
People taking credit for the work they didn't really do themselves, and probably the most grounded concern that generative AI is not a good replacement for real artists, and that using it in shipped games can actually make those games worse. And this anxiety isn't limited to developers anymore. Players are very aware of this too, and they're getting louder about it. You could see this clearly after a recent Bloomberg interview with Sven Vinke, where he briefly mentioned AI-related practices at Larian. Almost immediately, people online jumped to worst-case scenarios. AI replacing artists. AI-generated content sneaking into the next Divinity game. Those fears are understandable, but a lot of the backlash was aimed at things that weren't actually said. So let's break this down a bit. Here is my very personal, blunt take on this. AI-generated content that ends up in the final, shipped version of the game is a big no-no. Especially when it's something that players sees up close or interacts with directly. Characters, enemies, key environments. There are a lot of reasons for this, but honestly, the biggest issue is just simple. AI-generated assets are usually boring. And to be honest, they just look kinda ugly. They stand out. They don't quite match the rest of the game, and instead of blending in, they quietly drag the whole experience down. Which matters a lot, because the game industry is brutally competitive. And at this point, I think the gaming industry simply became self-regulating itself. More games come out every month than anyone could reasonably play. Players don't need to be told that something feels cheap or low effort. They can see it themselves. And if a game doesn't feel worth their time, no amount of marketing will save it. That's not just true for games either. A great recent example is the AI-generated holiday Coca-Cola ad. The goal was to create a warmth, nostalgia and cozy holiday vibes. The result was mostly confusion, memes and second-hand embarrassment for the brand. The tool that was used kinda destroyed the goal it was supposed to achieve. Games work the same way. And platforms like Steam are reinforcing this. Developers now have to disclose AI usage directly on the store page. Players can see it and decide if they're fine with it or not. And if it's not disclosed properly, Steam can still investigate. Not to mention how poorly optimized 3D AI-generated models currently are, making the process of preparing the game to run smoothly way more difficult. Then there is the case of Expedition 33, a fantastic indie game from a brand new studio. Huge success with many awards behind it. But shortly after the game launched, people discovered a few AI-generated textures, tiny background elements in an early level of the game. Those assets were replaced within a few days after the release. They were meant to be placeholders and landed in the final product by mistake. Yet still, the studio lost major awards over it. You can argue whether that was fair or not, but the message was very clear. Right now, the tolerance for AI-generated content in shipped games is extremely low. So the takeaway here is pretty simple. Leaving AI-generated assets in the final version of the game, especially ones that are visible or interactive, is a massive risk. Artistically, reputationally, and most simply financially. Not because of the outrage, not because of the headlines, but because right now they usually just make games worse. But let's now flip to the other side of this coin. Just because AI-generated assets can make a finished game worse, doesn't mean that generative AI as a whole should be thrown into a volcano and forgotten forever. Asset generation is only one small slice of what generative AI can do in game development. And in my opinion, developers who completely cut themselves off from the topic, either because just one part of this topic feels wrong or because they don't want to deal with explaining how they use it, are probably missing out on some genuinely useful opportunities. Because as we've already established, the video game industry is extremely competitive. And that competitiveness doesn't just show up at the player level. It also shows up during development. Budgets are under pressure. Timelines are getting tighter. Teams are expected to iterate faster, test ideas earlier, and figure out whether something works before it becomes expensive. This is where generative AI actually starts to make sense. From this perspective, generative AI used as a support tool in game development is not going away anytime soon, and very likely it's becoming a standard practice. To explain this properly, let's walk through an actual example. Imagine you and a few friends are making a third-person combat-focused game. Nothing huge, but not tiny either. Everyone has a role in your team. Johnny handles level design. Sarah does animation. Zendaya is the character artist, responsible for 3D models as well. And you are the gameplay designer, in charge of combat and enemies. You all get along great. Communication is solid, but even then, everyone has a slightly different mental image of what the final game is going to look like. And those tiny differences matter. That's why you need good tools to communicate ideas before anyone sinks a ton of time into the wrong thing. So let's say that you are tasked with designing a new enemy for dangerous areas. Something aggressive. Something that goes after the player the moment it spots them. There might already be some early ideas floating around, maybe even a rough concept art. In this case, let's say that the enemy you're making is a zombie. Now, even if you're a great gameplay designer, you probably don't have much experience making 3D models or concept art. But since everyone agreed that gameplay comes first in the game you're making, it is your job to figure out how this enemy should actually work before Zendaya spends weeks modeling it. It's your job to answer questions like, how does the enemy move? How big is it? How fast it is? How does it attack the player? Etc. Traditionally, designers handle this in a couple of ways. They might use a basic geometric shape, like a capsule or a box, and pretend it's a zombie. Or they might reuse an existing enemy model and mentally pretend it's something else. Or they don't test it at all and just go with what works on paper in the design, but I do not recommend such approach. And the rough prototyping with just simple shapes sometimes works, kind of. So let's say you go with the classic approach first. On the concept art that was created, the zombie is a tall, thin humanoid The idea is that it walks towards the player and bites them. To test this, you create a capsule that moves towards the player, triggers a simple collision box when it gets close, and deals damage. Maybe it even changes color before attacking, so the player knows when to dodge the incoming bite attacks. You squint a little, use your imagination, and say, yeah, this should probably feel good once we add animations and sound. You estimate it will take about a month for everyone to implement this enemy properly. And if something feels off later, well, you'll deal with it later. Now let's rewind and try the same thing with AI-assisted prototyping. You start with the concept art Zendaya made and generate a 3D model from it using something like Meshy AI. You drop it into the engine just to check the scale, and immediately problems start showing up. Specifically in the game you're making, a tall, thin enemy doesn't really feel great to aim at. Shooting that high up feels awkward, and landing hits on something that skinny feels annoying. You also notice that the dark grey skin tone that looked so cool in concept art in the actual game blends into the environment and the zombie becomes super hard to see. So you let Zendaya know now that the concept needs to change, before she spends time modeling the wrong thing. You tell her what specific elements need to change, but it's still up to her to add all the artistic touches and decide how it's actually going to look like in the end. Having the improved test model, you auto-rig it using something like Mixamo or Cascadeur and throw in a couple of basic animations. And suddenly, even more things become clear. Biting attacks look cool, but they require long, synced animations to feel right. In practice, they feel slow and frustrating, because it stops the player in place for way too long, and way too often. So you decide biting shouldn't be the main attack of your zombie. Instead, it should mostly attack with its hands, saving bites for rare moments in combat. That single decision affects animation workload for Sarah, but you made it early, before anyone but you committed any actual work on it. You also test how much time the player needs to recognize an incoming attack to dodge it. Turns out it's way harder to read animation cues than a simple color change on a capsule. So you pass the timing numbers to Sarah, which saves her a ton of guesswork when she will be animating the actual attacks. By the end of the process, you've got a solid prototype and a ton of data for other people. You know the enemy is fun to play with. You know what needs to change across art, animation and level design. And you now make a more realistic estimate. This enemy will take closer to 2.5 months to do properly. If you had stuck with the capsule-only approach, you would have reached the same conclusions, but much later, after more work that your friends did had been already done and wasted. And here's the important part. Once that prototype has done its job, the AI-generated assets can and should be thrown away. They were never meant to be in the shipped title. They weren't used to replace artists. They were used to reduce guesswork. The final game contains no AI-generated assets at all. What it contains instead is a better designed enemies, fewer surprises late in production, and a team that didn't have to rely on imagination and wishful thinking of a designer to make expensive decisions. And that is where generative AI actually makes sense in game development. This was only one specific example from a perspective of one specific person in the team. Such use cases can have even bigger impact on lowering production costs, iterating faster, and creating better experience for player without replacing humans that use AI tools. What I want to showcase by this is, I guess, Sure, from certain perspective, generative AI might seem like a sloppy tool for evil corporations that will take jobs away from actual artists. But if used properly, with honesty towards players in mind, it can actually be used to make games better and make human developers' lives easier, even from the perspective of better planning and avoiding crunch once the early guesswork decisions turn out to be completely wrong late in production. Possible uses of generative AI tools are numerous, and even more interesting from perspective of solo developers. I'll be covering various ways of utilizing such tools in honest way in the future videos on this channel. So if you're interested in this topic, make sure to subscribe. At the end of the day, generative AI tools aren't going anywhere. It's our job as game developers to make sure they are utilized properly with player experience in mind. See you in the next one.